Hello, hello. Welcome to Pint of a Story with me, Shobit. In this podcast, we bring you pint-sized stories from indie authors such as myself that you are likely not to have read before. Links to where the stories live on the internet will be in the show notes or description, and we do encourage you to click on them and read the stories for yourself. Hope you enjoyed today's story, and if you do, please share it around and subscribe if you like. Tales of grandeur, immoral and pure, greed and secrets, passion and glory. The pulse is rising, the plot's surprising. You captivated, that's the point of the story. That is the point of a story, and with this week we are back with the runner-up of the 3-2-1 contest, where we suggested the prompt and the writers from Penmancy wrote and contested. The stories were judged by Penmancy's panel. This one is called Isakki Murder Case, written by Sudha Ramnath and first published in March 2021 on penmancy.com. Penmancy.com is a website we deeply care about as they share the same passion as us, which is to provide indie stories a platform to reach as many people as possible. To read this story and many more, please visit penmancy.com. Your feedback or comments really matter, so please leave some. And hope you like this one. Here goes. Father Chaco put the phone down, leaned back on his chair, and sighed deeply. He was 65, balding, with a thatch of grey hair running all around his pate. But his warm brown eyes, twinkling behind a pair of specs, belied whatever impression of sternness his weather-lined face suggested. He was a benevolent priest, looking after the spiritual needs of a small cluster of villages in Kerala. The call had been from the prison officials. George Kutty, a convicted killer on death row, had requested a meeting with him. It was a duty call, and he would definitely go. No dilemma there. But George Kutty also wanted to meet Cheryl, and that was going to be next to impossible. With another long sigh, he took off his specs, placed them on the table, leaned back against the chair, put his hands behind his head, and closed his eyes. His thoughts flew to the sensational murder of Isakki a few years back. Labelled Isakki Murder Case by the press, the incident had shocked and fascinated the public. The brutality of the murder and the pathos in the story kept the case alive for a long time. Cheryl's photos were splashed all over the media. She became the center point of the story, even though she was not the victim. One reason could be the intoxicating combination of her looks, a rare innocence, extreme vulnerability, and a stirring beauty. The tragic circumstances of her being orphaned at a young age, along with her two kid sisters, made it a heart-rending story that caught the public's imagination. Cheryl and her younger sisters had been taken in by her uncle, Isakki, and brought up in a small house set within his modest coconut farm. Isakki had sacrificed his whole life to bring up the orphan girls. He had not married because no girl was willing to take on the responsibilities of 3 young girls. Cheryl had finished her studies and had started working at the village school. George Kutty was a teacher at the same school. The prosecution case was that he had developed feelings for Cheryl. On the day of the murder, he had gone to her house to convince her about his love. She had refused his advances. Her resistance only seemed to infuriate him further, and he had tried forcing himself on her. When her uncle unexpectedly returned and tried to stop him, he had taken the butcher's knife lying in the kitchen and hacked him brutally to death. The forensics had confirmed that multiple wounds were a result of powerful thrusts of the knife. The doctors had remarked about how the depth of the wound showed the fury and rage that must have fueled the actions of the murder. George Kutty had neither confirmed nor denied his culpability. But finally, when Judge Thresiama asked him if he pleaded guilty, he had accepted his guilt quietly. The judge had observed the following. Typically, only in the case of a premeditated murder involving brutal and violent killing, I award the death penalty. But I want to make an exception in this case. A woman has a right to say no to a man's advances. For too long, women have been under acid attacks and other brutalities of their refusal. I wanted to send a harsh message to all men that any violence shown to a woman as a result of a refusal will not be pardoned. It will be looked at as an extreme case of cruelty and will be dealt with severely. That's why I am awarding the death sentence to George Kutty. This is a warning to other men who want to hurt or show any form of violent behavior towards women who refuse their amorous advances, or towards people who are trying to stop the advances, as in this case. This had all happened a couple of years back. Later on, the press had moved to other cases and the public had forgotten about it, their interest replaced by other sensations of the world. Father Chaco himself had almost forgotten the case, except at those times when he passed through the side of the village where the tragedy had happened. Then he would remember Cheryl, how she had shut herself up in the house, rarely coming out. Her sister, though, stoically attended school, despite the gossip, sly looks, and innuendos they had to endure. He had left a note to his secretary that he was not available for the entire day and called the driver. The car entered the village and veered off towards a thick cluster of coconut trees. A small dirt track, lined on both sides by more trees, led into the dense plantations. The early browns of the coconut tree barks were suddenly interrupted by bright green leaves of shorter plantain trees. There were clusters of dark green bananas hanging from most of them. The house was in a clearing surrounded by a patch built of stone, and there was a hand well visible behind it. Rough steps led up to a narrow veranda in the seating. As he laboriously climbed the stairs, the two younger girls peeped out and were immediately followed by Cheryl, who shooed them back into the house. She was wearing a sari rendered colorless with regular bleach. Her enormous eyes looked sad, as if the tragedy that struck her a few years back had left a permanent shadow. He was soon sitting in the wooden chair on the veranda, and the girls served him a glass of fresh, tender coconut water. "Cheryl, my child, I have come to talk to you about something serious." Cheryl looked up with a sudden fear leaping into her eyes. Chaco continued, "I had a call from the prison authorities. George Kutty is to be hanged sometime next month. Before that, he wants to meet me and you." There was shocked silence. Some unseen birds chirped from the trees. A hen flew by, cackling, and a few chickens followed her squawking. The police creaked as someone drew a bucket of water from the well. "Me? Why?" Her eyes suddenly pulled up and the tears cascaded down her cheeks. Chaco spoke more calmly. "It is customary to grant the last wishes of people on death row. I don't know why, but George Kutty wants to meet with you." No reply from her. Her eyes brimmed with fresh tears. "I think you should agree. I know how difficult this is for you. It is going to bring up all those bad memories, hurting you all over again. But think about this. He has suffered too. Also, when the press asked him about personal questions about you repeatedly, he never opened up. He has never talked to anyone about you or the case. Please don't say no. Be compassionate. Love for God prospers when a fault is forgiven." As more tears poured out of her eyes, she stood unmoving and mute. As Chaco left, he turned back to look at her. The tears were still pouring down her cheeks. She had not agreed to the meeting, but had not declined either. A week later, Chaco had sent the driver to collect her, and she had quietly come to sit on the back seat. The driver drove through the long, winding roads with fields on either side. The intoxicating fragrance of fresh chembagam flowers, brightly yellow, placed in front of a small photo of Christ on the dashboard, filled the car. Chaco sneaked a look at Cheryl, sitting on the back seat next to him. She was wearing a well-worn but neat sari. Her hair was let loose. A few tresses were collected from either side of the temples and tied back into a neat, small plait. The typical Kerala style. She seemed composed, but her puffy eyes gave away the fact that she had been crying. She was looking out of the windows, though Chaco could see that her mind was elsewhere. The 2 months of heavy Kerala rains had finally stopped. The sun glinted off small ponds filled with bluish-green waters. The grass on either side of the road was verdant green. There was a profusion of flowers on most trees. They gave sudden glimpses of pinks, violets, blues, and yellows, dappling in the sunlight. Chaco thought about the flowers, how most of them would go into decorating the Ona Pookalams, the colorful designs made of flowers arranged in intricate, stunning designs during the Onam festival. They reached the grim concrete structure of the prison. They had to sign many forms, and finally a guard took them into the room. He shut the grill doors and waited outside with his back turned. The drab grey walls added to the gloominess of the dingy little room. There was hardly any sunlight. The room was lit by a single naked yellow bulb perched directly on the dirty wall. There was a musty smell in the room, a result of dampness due to the long monsoons that had closed the settings of the prison. Chaco felt the sudden chill and gloominess of the prison room after sparkling sunshine outside. There were 2 chairs in front of the grimy table and a rough wooden bench on either side. George Kutti was brought in by the prison guards and made to sit on the bench. Chaco studied him from behind his glasses. The years in prison had made him frail, but hadn't robbed him of his rough, good looks. His eyes seemed to be alive, though hungry. Hungry for company, Chaco thought to himself. He turned to look at Cheryl. The fresh bout of tears had left streaks on her pale cheeks, but she seemed to be averting her gaze and was not looking at George Kutti. George was silent for a very long time. He cleared his throat and looked at Chaco. When he spoke, his voice had measured depth and hoarseness, as if he had been silent for too long a time. Father, I want to pray for my soul. I have thought a lot about God in recent times, and I want His forgiveness. I want you to bless me and absolve me in God's eyes. The court and the verdict are not my concern. But for me, God's absolution is the most important. He is more magnanimous and merciful. I want Him to forgive me for whatever is wrong in my actions. Chaco reached for his hands on the table and pressed them. My son, God is merciful and works in His own ways. He is our rock, our fortress, and our deliverer. But before you ask for His forgiveness, you must learn to forgive yourself. Don't underestimate the power of forgiving yourself. It lifts burdens that have been weighing on you and frees your mind from guilt. It opens up your mind to God and fills you with His love. Both of them got onto the floor and knelt. Soon the father and the prisoner were murmuring familiar, oft-spoken words that have given comfort to many. They got up and went to sit back on their seats. All the while Cheryl had been on her chair, sad and lost in her grief. There was a heavy silence. A lonely crow was cawing far away. George Kutti's voice sounded hoarse as he asked, "Can I talk to Cheryl privately?" Father Chaco stiffened in his seat and turned to look at Cheryl. Her eyes were distant and she trembled slightly at George Kutti's request. Chaco waited for a minute to see if she was going to refuse. Then he slowly stood up, patted her shoulder encouragingly, and left the room. Cheryl and George's eyes met for the first time and she burst out weeping. She took his hands in hers and sobbed. "George, I would have never agreed to this if I had known that it was going to be the death penalty. I would have confessed immediately that I had committed the murder. Now, from the judge's words, I realize that if I were the murderer, it would not have been the capital punishment. I am heartbroken that I am the cause of death for my dearest friend, my most beloved. I can't bear that you're going to die anonymously. People are calling you names. A murderer, a heartless devil. They think they forced yourself on me when you were the most decent person and had never laid a finger. She continued to weep. George gently patted her hands and said, Cheryl, Isakki deserved to die. He had been abusing you since you were a kid. You never opened your mouth to complain. You bore up all that for your sister's sake. But when I proposed to you and wanted to marry you, you threatened that he would go after your sisters for gratification. No wonder you got into a rage and grabbed the knife and killed him, even before I could stop you. I remember your fury did not die, even after he stopped breathing. You kept thrusting the knife into his lifeless body. Is it? I don't remember anything except my outrage at his suggestion. I only came to my senses when you were holding my hands and consoling me. But your quick decision to take the blame so that I could continue to be there for my sisters was so noble. You didn't want them to suffer because they had already been orphaned once. As they held each other's hands tight and continued to shed tears, the guard signaled that the visiting time was over. If all the love in the universe could be condensed into a small place, it lay between the two pairs of hands that clung to each other desperately on the rough surface of the table. So, we hope you liked that story enough to tempt you to subscribe. We encourage you to share it with anyone else you can think of that would like to hear our stories as well. But do not forget, it is the writers that make the stories, so please read them for yourself by clicking the link in the description. That'll mean the world to us. Thank you for your time, and we hope to see you with our next. In the meantime, remember, if you can't find what you're looking for, create it. Take care.